Well, thank you very much. Of course, these are topics that have very long histories and deep roots. And I would probably note 1,000 years, 500 years, 200 years, 75 years as intervals that are relevant for us. 1,000 years ago, the religious wars between Christianity and Islam started with the Crusades in 1095. This gave a certain culture and self-consciousness to Europe as Christendom, and Christendom that would free the Holy Land, Christendom that would confront the Christian non-believers, the reconquest of Spain in the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, and so on. 15th century was similar. The second phase of this creation of Western political culture came with the discovery, conquest, and settlement of the Americas. This was one of the most decisive events in human history, starting with the Columbus's voyage and also with the European presence in Asia. This gave a self-consciousness to Europe as Christendom and increasingly a racial awareness as Europe created a slave system with more than 10 million Africans transported in the so-called Middle Passage to the Americas to settle the Americas as a slave-holding system of Europe. The third phase, I would say, is starting with the Industrial Revolution and the industrial dominance of Europe over Asia in the 19th century, and of course the complete conquest of Africa in the second half of the 19th century and much of Asia at the same time. This gave rise to still more theories. Of course, Christian superiority was always one of them. White superiority was also very clear. Race became a very conscious quasi-scientific or pseudo-scientific factor, starting with the Enlightenment. And then in the 19th century, most of the philosophers of the 19th century took it for granted that Europe was genetically superior. And then with Darwin, this was given an added scientific edge. Darwin himself argued in The Descent of Man that in 1871 that yes, the savages were humans, because that was debated, but they were lower humans, and they would go extinct, actually, just like the great apes would go extinct over time. This became core to what became the Nazi ideology in the 20th century, but Nazi ideology was firmly grounded on the science of the day in Germany and German evolutionary thought. And so you had genetic superiority, racial superiority, cultural superiority, Christian superiority, and some of the more moderate philosophers of the 19th century, like John Stuart Mill, said, well, it's probably not genetic, but it is cultural, it's deep. Europe has a vocation to bring the rest of civilization into true civilization. This, of course, was taken up in French ideology, in ideology across Europe. Then the last phase, I would say, is the 75 years that I mentioned, basically since the end of World War II, when the United States, which is an Anglo-Saxon culture, a very racially oriented society. Remember, North America slaughtered the indigenous populations, committed multiple genocides, enslaved African Americans and ran an apartheid system for a century after the end of the Civil War. The US became the dominant power in the world, very much learning from Britain. So it's a very Anglo-Saxon empire. Europe receded in a way during this period and seemed to have learned a lot, except I'm not so sure now in recent events how much Europe has learned, because it still has its deep cultural biases and proclivities that we see manifest right now, for example, in the wars in Ukraine and in the Middle East. So all of this is to say there are very deep roots of European felt superiority. This became Anglo-Saxonized in the 19th century when Britain became the dominant power of the world. The Anglo-Saxon tradition continued with the United States being the dominant power in the world. And where do we see it manifest? Well, with the rise of China and the spread of technology and the evening out of power in a lot of ways, including the proliferation of nuclear weapons, which is an equalizer in its horrible way, this superiority of the West, which was always a noxious idea, is directly challenged. And the Western powers don't like it being challenged. The root of the war in Ukraine, in my view, is the United States isn't going to be told what to do by anybody, including by Russia. So if the US wants to put missiles or military bases or NATO into Ukraine, no other country, this is explicit US doctrine, has the right to stop that, including Russia, which has a kind of concern because it's Russia's border, and Russia doesn't want the United States military on its border. So in this sense, all of this continues, and we see all sorts of manifestations of this in the war in Gaza as well, because Israel emerged out of British imperialism at the end of World War I, and the dominance of the British, US, Israel narrative about control of this region, which has two peoples, but one dominant power, Israel, and Palestine not having political rights, is still very much centered on the US, UK story. And this is what the war is about. Will there be political rights for both peoples after decades of abusive behavior by Israel, or will there be actually still this narrative that emerged already a century ago after the end of World War I by the British Empire? So we still see the long shadows of these views, and they're typically hidden from sight, but they're very powerful.
Thank you very much for that answer. Peter, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you the same question I briefly asked you when you were visiting CUHK a few months ago, and give you a little more time and thought to respond. So just to refresh your memory, there was this skit on the Daily Show years ago. Remember the Ground Zero Mosque was being built, and Fox News was, fear mongering about it. A lot of Islamophobic rhetoric. They're going to build a terror mosque. And the Daily Show was making fun of them because they pointed out that while they spent so much time on the funders of this terror mosque, they neglected to mention that one of the main funders was also a co-owner of News Corp. So they had two comedians come on, and one had a T-shirt saying Team Stupid, the other one said Team Evil. And they were trying to figure out if Fox News was just evil or stupid. Now, that kind of setup, that conceit, made me immediately think of the U.S. ruling class, or ruling classes around the world, but let's focus on the U.S.'s ruling class. So everybody believes that they're good. Everyone develops a sense of morality. Morality is kind of hard written into us to a certain extent. outside of psychopaths who have a cognitive defect where they can't empathize. But I'm wondering, in your experience, you've swum in these circles of the blob in DC, and I'm wondering, what do you think? Is it Team Evil's explanation, which is, they understand in their own way the kind of basic realist story that the world is nasty and somebody's got to be the dominant player. Someone has to be the hegemon, the mafia don. And if it isn't the US, it's going to be somebody else who's worse. So we can commit all sorts of evil around the world because it's for the greater good of preventing an even worse evil. Or do you think it's mostly Team Stupid's explanation, which is that, the members of the US ruling class, they go to the same universities, they their peers are similar, they're educated the same way, they read the same books, they use the same media outlets. But that information diet excludes arguments and evidence from other sides that would challenge their beliefs. So which of these two explanations do you lean toward, or do you think it's a mixture of both?
Well, I think it's in many ways the same, even as you've explained it. I think the view in the United States that the US is the best for the world is actually felt. It's actually believed. Why? It's so peculiar. If you live outside the US, as I do much of the time, it's perfectly weird to think that. We're 4.1% of the world population. Don't you think the other 95.9% has something to say about their future?
Or a
So,
decent respect for the opinions of mankind, as in the Declaration of Independence?
yes. But the answer is no. We know better. Well, the French knew better, the British knew better, the Americans know better. So it's not restricted to the U.S. scene. I think there are many levels. I'm trying to figure out the answer to your question over many years. Also, we're hardwired that way. I'm convinced, in the sense that there are good evolutionary reasons to believe that what we call parochial altruism is a fact, which means yes, you can be kind, beneficent, generous to the in-group. But to the out-group, that's an enemy. And I think we're probably quite well primed for that. It's one of the most decisive features of psychology, social psychology, that there is a difference between the in-group and the out-group, and that you can artificially create the out-group over almost anything. You tell kids you're blue or you're red in the morning. By afternoon, the red group hates the blue group and the blue group hates the red group, and they're not playing games. They're not realists trying to play a game. They actually are now generating emotional input into how can we defeat the other side. So to my mind, it's pretty deep. How it works is complicated. I don't think anybody's really figured it out completely. I'm not in the inner sanctums of the blob most of the time, or very rarely. Though I know a lot of these people. Some are my students. Some, and maybe they're on the outer shell of the inner blob. I don't know, but I think that there are so many mechanisms of self-reinforcement, of self-glorification, that partly it is the media, the mainstream media, following the dictates from above, who pay the bills, who make the advertising, who have infiltrated the mainstream media anyway, literally with personnel from the CIA or other places over the years. We know this. Or it is the self-referencing, or it is to make your clientele comfortable because no one likes to hear these things. So I think there are many mechanisms at work, just like the questions of how do ethics and morals and mores work in general. It's complicated, and sometimes it's pressure, sometimes it's deceit, sometimes it's cynicism, sometimes it's self-deception. I think all of those are somewhat at play, but it's hard to stand up against the establishment in general. And there's also a very famous line, and I meant to check out whether it's really Mark Twain or H.L. Mencken or both of them, but that you can't convince a person of something when his job depends on, or his income depends on believing the opposite. And this also is true. People are dependent on going along. These structures are real. These structures of power are real.
But what I'm trying to say is that even this little country of mine, the Netherlands, is extremely at the forefront always to jump into or to help the US and other European countries in their imperialist endeavors. They want to be the leader of the NATO. The recently Dutch soldiers were found in Lebanon, and I'm like, apartheid is a Dutch invention. It's a Dutch word. So I'm always saying that I feel it's much more Europe wide. Often there's this idea that the rest of Europe are vassal states of the United States, and I in a way I agree, but I think there's not a lot of difference between, for example, the UK's role in imperialism and countries like France or smaller countries like the Netherlands. I feel they all have a very active role when it comes to Western imperialism. What would you say about that?
Well, I think you're just being proud because if the British taught the Americans all that they know, the Dutch taught the British all that they know. After all, it was
Yeah.
the glorious revolution in 1688 that modernized Britain. This is a Dutch invention. The Netherlands was in the forefront of colonialism, imperialism, racism. But then it lost its military and naval dominance to Britain, but it still showed what it could do in Batavia, and the colony of today's Indonesia was very brutal. So this is indeed something that is European-wide. I think it's an interesting question historically, by the way, whether there is historically and ideologically a difference of Northern and Southern Europe in this regard. Southern Europe, Catholic Europe, was the first global imperialists, Spain and Portugal, and they lost out eventually to Northern Europe, to the Netherlands and to Britain especially, and to France. France is a little bit in between the Protestant Catholic divide, but there were a few checks, a little bit mild checks on this, coming from the Pope and Catholicism, not at the beginning, but by the 17th and 18th centuries. The Spanish decided that it was wrong to enslave the indigenous populations of the Americas, though not the Africans. So it was a kind of mixed bag. In Northern Europe, there weren't too many scruples of that kind for a long time. Anyway, this is a footnote, but I would agree that this has been European-wide, and it manifests whoever is the dominant power. So the Netherlands was a great ocean power and a great imperial power up until the 17th century. It lost out to Britain after that. British dominance came in the 19th century because of the steam engine, basically, and military power that came with industrialization. And so I wouldn't say that it's distinctly cultural within Europe, but I would say that the dominant culture that we saw turned on which was the dominant power. France has had its civilizing mission. Britain did it in a different way. Each one that came to the fore was sure that God was on their side. that culture was on their side, that technology was on their side, and probably genes when they discovered what genes were, or evolution was on their side. So I think each one has had its turn. But European dominance now is, real dominance is 250 years old, and European ascendance is 500 years old. And our cultures are deeply penetrated by those ideas. And we're living through this moment, especially with the rise of China, where this is coming to an end. So I think that this really is a long cycle. We happen to be observers of the moment when the whole thing is falling down. One might have said that at the end of World War II, with the end of the straightforward imperialism. But that was a long, drawn-out 40 years, 50 years war to end the direct European imperial rule. But the ideas didn't stop, and the U.S. does its empire in a different way. The U.S. runs its empire mainly through regime change operations, and through military bases. So the U.S. has military bases in 80 countries, about 800 military bases around the world, and it overthrows governments regularly. And that's how it runs its empire, rather than directly having its place on the map. So we're still very much in the midst of this.